Today I wanted to talk about the new tactical deployment expansion for Warhammer 40k, and honestly why I don't think it's going to do very well. Hello and welcome back to Warspecs Tactics for a bit of a discussion around this new book. For those that aren't aware, Games Workshop have announced a new small expansion for Warhammer 40k. It's a book called Tactical Deployment. It has the words Chapter Approved and Mission Pack written on it, and it seems to be a terrain-based expansion coming out alongside a bunch of new terrain kits that they're releasing, most likely to help drive sales of these a bit by giving them some more rules in-game. We don't know the full picture of exactly what's happening with this book, but there was a preview on Warhammer Community yesterday that gave us a little bit more of an inkling as to what's going on. So this book is aimed at the match play version of the game, and seems to be at least in some way trying to cater towards competitive games. The core mechanic of the book seems to be players bringing their own terrain to a match play game, where as well as bringing your army along, you're going to have a certain amount of points of terrain that you can bring, and you have to bring up to a certain number, for example 50 to 100 points worth of terrain for a combat patrol game. It does have a new mission pack as well, match play missions with slightly different deployments of objectives and things, and also some new terrain based secondaries, such as being able to pick ones to control critical pieces of terrain at the end of the game. Honestly, I'm not sure how enthused I am for another pack of missions at the moment. 9th edition hasn't been out for very long at all, and already we have the Eternal War missions from the main book, and then the Grand Tournament mission pack from Chapter Approved, which adds a bit more variety and a few different twists on secondary objectives. I guess it's not necessarily a bad thing that we've got even more missions, but I'm not really sure that we needed any more right at the moment. As per some of the articles they've talked about, they seem to want this to be a system where people could have an event or tournament where the tournament organisers didn't necessarily have all that much terrain and basically rely on the players to source it for them. I can see what they're getting at with this. One barrier to getting a lot of people together to organise a tournament of Warhammer 40k is you need a venue, a whole bunch of tables, and then a decent amount of terrain to go on those tables, particularly in 9th edition where they advocate a decent amount of it. So theoretically it might make making an event a little bit easier, though honestly I'm not sure that will really be the case in reality, as I'll get onto later in the video. In the book it appears that they have various different terrain datasheets for certain different bits of Games Workshop terrain that you can bring to the game. We'll look at a couple of those previewed ones shortly, but basically certain size buildings cost certain amounts of points and give you a few special rules that might help some of the units in your army that are near them. I think it's intended that these are used with the actual Games Workshop plastic terrain kits, as the size and measurement of these buildings don't seem very well defined, so the only way to get them exact would be to use the actual Games Workshop kits, which is probably what they're intending. In terms of what we don't know exactly how the terrain setup procedure is going to happen. Will you just be able to use all of your terrain pieces and put them in your own deployment zone? Or will you be creating the battlefield before you deploy, putting it down in a few set locations, and then maybe dicing off for which deployment zone you get? This will be part of the core mechanic of the book, and until we know it we can't really be 100% sure exactly how good the games will be. To be honest, I can see some advantages of players being incentivized to set up their own terrain in their own deployment zone, as it might encourage people to bring decent line of sight blocking terrain, which is almost always an advantage if it's set up within your own drop zone. So here's one of the previewed terrain datasheets. This one's called a Storage Fane, and it's one of the new buildings that's from a specific kit in this new Battlezone Manufactorum terrain set that they're bringing out shortly. It has its own tactical terrain datasheet, it'll cost you 40 points, and it gives you a little picture of what it's supposed to look like, including something called a pipeway access point, which might be some sort of mechanic from units coming out of reserve or something, we don't know yet. It defines the terrain piece's footprint with the little yellow dashed line on the diagram on the right, and it gives us its various different terrain traits, including breachable, defensible, light cover and scalable. So this one isn't bad for infantry to hide in, but it isn't obscuring terrain. It basically has a special rule called ammunition storage, which gives you a couple of special rules for your army. Any model that's wholly within the storage fane's terrain area means that it can reroll ones to hit with its ranged attacks, and also a unit that's wholly within can throw a lot of more grenades than they normally be able to, half of the squad being able to, rather than just one model. Out of the two rules, the reroll ones to hit sounds more powerful to me, as grenades tend to be quite short ranged, so you'd have to hope that your opponent was getting really quite close to you if you wanted to make use of that rule. The rerolling ones to hit isn't bad, but you might be just a bit limited as to how many models you can pack in that little shed. I'll be honest, just from the looks of the terrain, it doesn't really look like it really fits in all that well with shooting buffs. To me it looks pretty much just like a bog standard ruin, no ammunition dumps or anything about, so it might be a little bit weird in game to have this shed arbitrarily making your shooting better, where maybe another shed across the board makes your vehicles get repaired or something. I guess you could always potentially do a bit of conversion and make it a bit more storagey. Talking of sheds that repair your vehicles, next up we have the engine shed. This one's a much bigger piece of terrain, and it costs 60 terrain points, so a little bit more. Other than that, it basically has most of the keywords that the storage fane has. Again, it has that pipeway access point. It does have a keyword critical terrain feature, which in the preview they had a secondary mission that could get you points for controlling things like this at the end of the game. And as you might expect, it does have a more vehicle-orientated special rule. You need to have an infantry squad at least partly within the shed, and a vehicle entirely within the shed, and that vehicle can basically heal D3 wounds per turn. To be honest, it might be a little bit limiting exactly what vehicles can have room to set up within the shed. I don't know if there might be just enough space to fit in a whirlwind or a guard basilisk or something. I guess you could give yourself a little bit of a reliable bunker to have it shooting from and auto-healing if the enemy does manage to shoot it a bit. So honestly, I do think that the terrain rules do look quite fun, and they could make for some different experience games of 40k, but now I would like to talk about why I don't think this expansion is going to take off. Firstly, they seem to be really quite aiming this at match play and maybe more competitive games, but it just doesn't really seem very suited for a match play or competitive environment in my opinion. Firstly, it's not a mandatory expansion that anyone has to use if they don't want to, and generally if that's the case you'll get people who aren't buying it just because they're not so interested, or even just because both players will probably need a set of these rules to be able to use them properly, and you might often be playing against people who haven't made the same purchase. Other books like Chapter Approved that update the points costs are pretty much mandatory for the current version of Warhammer 40k, so that means that a lot more people buy them. Next, a lot of people don't have collections of terrain at home, they just use the terrain in the club, and naturally if you don't have any yourself and aren't really that interested in acquiring any at great expense from Games Workshop, then this book isn't exactly going to do a lot for you. It also appears that the terrain datasheets are very much set models. I really don't know how much allowance they're going to have for scratch built or different manufacturers making terrain. Certainly not everyone just buys the plastic kits straight from Games Workshop. In general, match play is supposed to be a more balanced and competitive game of Warhammer 40k. Not that there isn't already a fair amount of imbalance in the game already, but I think that this would make it worse. You're likely to have certain terrain rules that are a lot better for certain armies than others. For example, rules that buff grenades and vehicles and ranged firepower aren't all that useful for a Chaos Demon army, for example. And allowing people to set up the terrain on the battlefield themselves might make it a better tactical decision to tailor the terrain to your exact army. Say if you were building a big gunline army, then you might just turn up with a whole load of pipelines or craters or something, and just make it so you're playing on a really light terrain battlefield, all the better to gun down your opponents. It'll also advantage the people who have the better terrain collection. Warhammer 40k already has advantages for people who can buy the best models going at the time, and that's going to kind of double down on this, I think. Tournament-wise, if you are asking everyone to bring their own terrain, it's going to add an absolute ton of things that people need to transport. 40k armies can already be quite bulky with all the packaging that you need, but at least one person can usually carry their entire army in one go from, say, the car to a venue, and I suspect that's not going to be very possible if you both need to bring your army and also half a table's worth of terrain. You're going to need a lot more boxes, and it might just be completely unfeasible for people who don't drive. I think tournament attendance will generally be lower if people use this expansion, as instead of it being a fairly free event where basically anyone can turn up provided they have the rules for 40k, you're now limiting the pool of players who might attend to people who own this book, and also people who have the terrain to bring along to the game as well, which a lot of people just don't bother with at home if they don't have their own gaming table there and play at a club. Also, if you are running some sort of tournament, then adding another factor of randomness and imbalance doesn't necessarily sound like a good thing, as I'm sure that any system that they devise will have ways that you can exploit it and make the terrain that you bring along really advantage your own army, which maybe not everyone will bother doing. I know this could be a different challenge to master in the game, but personally it's not one that really interests me all that much. I personally enjoy building and devising tactics for the armies themselves, with the battlefield being more of a backdrop. It just seems a bit weird to have part of your army essentially being the battlefield itself, which doesn't really make much sense to me from a logical point of view. As I mentioned from the mission pack, I think that we've already got ample match play missions at the moment. The new missions in this might be very good, but honestly I can't see how they're going to be all that different from the Eternal War or GT pack, both of which have only been out for a couple of months anyway. Maybe I am being a little bit harsh on this book. Don't get me wrong, I do think that it could be fun between two players having a more casual match play game, particularly if they both had decent amounts of terrain to bring along, and agreed not to be too cutthroat or competitive with trying to manipulate the terrain to their advantage. But it really doesn't mean that the supplement's likely to take off to the player base as a whole. I would just be frankly very surprised if 6 months down the line, many people are playing missions with this book. I'm always happy to be proven wrong though, if it turns out to be better than expected. So let me know what you think of this tactical deployment expansion. Is it going to fail as badly as I suspect it will, or do you think it'll see some widespread play? If you've enjoyed the discussion, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly be taking a second look at the book once we know the full details. And if you have been enjoying the videos on this channel, I'd just like to mention that I do have a Patreon page which supports new video creation and can be found in the video description down below. Recording all the discussion videos does take quite a bit of time, so if you are enjoying regularly, then any support is massively appreciated. Channel patrons get to see certain videos early each week, there's regular polls and votes to see what sort of videos come next, and also you're automatically entered into the Auspex Tactics prize giveaway each year with a chance to win some big Warhammer kits. If any of that sounds good, or you'd just like to help support the channel, then the link is down in the video description below. And in any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.